Welcome ACS members, and thank you so much for joining us for tonight's Fireside chat. As is always the case, please enter your questions throughout in the YouTube chat channel, and we'll select the best ones at the end when we'll ask our special guest his views on those areas. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to our guest tonight, the Minister for Communications, Cyber, Safety and the Arts, the Honourable Paul Fletcher. Welcome, Minister.
Good to be with you, Andrew.
Minister, how have you been coping the last couple of months as restrictions started to tighten up with COVID-19?
Well, I guess for all of us, we've had to adapt and change our behaviours very quickly. Certainly as a politician, it's quite strange not being able to physically interact with people, not being able to go to constituent events, not being able to go to industry events. But I think like everybody, what I've found is the quality of video conferencing technology is impressive, and you can do an amazing amount from a laptop. So I think for all of us, it's been an opportunity to be made aware of what is possible, and it's amazing how much you can get on with and get done. In my case, I've been solely in Sydney, apart from I think 3 or 4 trips to Canberra over this period. I haven't been on an aeroplane for over 2 months, so that's been very refreshing. I've spent more time with my family than I'm used to spending. So there's been some pluses as well as obviously some other challenges, particularly in dealing with my portfolio responsibilities. I've got a number of sectors within my portfolio that have been very heavily affected by the social distancing requirements and the other changes that COVID-19 has brought in. The arts sector has been hit very heavily. The media sector with a sharp drop in advertising. So there's been a lot of work engaging with these sectors and with colleagues as we respond to these challenges. But I guess what I've found, as I think most of us have, is it's surprising what you can get done.
How about we look into that a little bit? It is surprising what you can get done in a crisis. So what pockets have you seen, something that inspires you, whether it's businesses or individuals pivoting to cope with the crisis?
Oh, look, I have been inspired by what I've seen. I think, first of all, Australians generally feel very proud of the fact that our institutions, political parties, governments, Commonwealth, state, territory, business, unions, peak bodies, the way that all of the institutions have come together and the way that as a nation we've collectively dealt with this challenge. Now, we don't take for granted where we are. We obviously all recognise that there could be a second wave, that while the number of people with the disease and the number of deaths thankfully has been much, much lower than most other countries, nevertheless, we do all acknowledge that there's a continuing challenge. But that being said, I think Australians generally have been heartened and reassured by the way that our nation collectively has responded and the way that our institutions have responded. I think trust levels have been positively affected as a result. Now, from my privileged position as a minister, I've seen extraordinary contributions made by all kinds of organisations. If I could mention, for example, the role of Atlassian, Scott Farquhar, Mike Cannon-Brooks and the entire team, they've really stepped forward to share their expertise on things like developing the COVID-safe app and some of the other communications tools that the government was working on. I know they worked with New South Wales government, they certainly worked with the Commonwealth government, but many other companies as well, many other individuals have shared their expertise. But if I look at the courage of our frontline health workers who have continued to be there every day to deliver services. People in Australia have known throughout this crisis that if they needed hospital treatment, they would get into a hospital, they would be seen, they would be treated. And sadly, troublingly, in a lot of other countries with first world health systems, those systems have been under great pressure, and people in those countries have sadly been left very uncertain about what would happen to them if they needed to go to hospital. So our health workers, what they've been doing has been inspirational, but I think across the country, I think if you look at the work that the supermarkets have done, Coles, Woolworths, Aldi, IGA, the work they did to keep food flowing, to keep their logistics systems operating, and then to manage the people being able to shop safely, keeping their staff safe. That's been terrific work. So across the community, across the business sector, I think we've all seen some things that have been very encouraging and frankly inspirational.
In terms of your personal observations and views, we hear many people say this is a new normal. What parts won't go back to life as we once knew it?
I think there will be some things that we will all learn from this, that we will incorporate into our behaviour. So I think probably most of us have seen that video conferencing is a more effective and flexible tool than we might have thought. I think most of us will have seen that working from home, it can get stuff done, and I think we might see a bit more of that. But I must say, I'm sceptical about some of the claims, some of the people who say, well, everything has changed. I do think that we will get back to normality and that most of us will still go to work every day. I think those behaviours will largely continue. And one of the reasons I say that is having been around public policy in IT and communications for over 20 years now, a frightening long time, I well remember in the late 90s all kinds of claims that broadband would mean that none of us would ever need to come together anymore. There was a book called Death of Distance, a good book written by a British journalist, Frances Cairncross, and she wrote about the first wave of broadband and what kind of changes that might bring. And a lot of people at the time were predicting people will work from home, nobody will need to come into the office anymore. In fact, we've all kept coming into the office even though technology has given us alternatives because we're social creatures. We like to interact, we like to engage, and the spontaneous discussions you have with somebody in the hallway, in the lunchroom, often bring up good ideas, solve business problems. So that human instinct to interact is very important, and in knowledge industries, and increasingly so much of our economy is made up of knowledge industries, that human interaction is really key. In a previous portfolio, I was Minister for Urban Infrastructure and Cities, and so got exposed to a lot of the thinking and the academic work about cities and what drives cities. And we've seen cities become more and more important, and in knowledge work, that is particularly because of that urge for people to interact, to bounce ideas off each other. So I think once we get to a point where we're not, for public health reasons, constrained from being together, I think that human urge will reassert itself, and we will see mostly people coming into work, engaging with each other physically. People will use some more of the flexibility from time to time in terms of video conferencing, but my own view is we will see, in the main, people coming together physically because we're social creatures, we like to do that, and we produce better outcomes by doing it.
An opportunity to plug the NBN though, in an environment where everyone was strongly encouraged wherever possible to work from home and have schools going online. How has the NBN performed over these last 8 weeks?
I have to say, when Australia really needed it, the NBN has come through. There are over 7 million premises connected to the NBN, over 11 million able to connect, and without wanting to get political, in 2013 there were 51,000 fixed line network connected premises. So 51,000 in 2013, over 7 million now connected, over 11 million able to connect. We've really pushed the rollout. We've pushed to get the rollout happening as quickly as possible. And what that's meant is that when Australians really needed the bandwidth that the NBN can offer, it was there for them. Very commonly over the past few weeks, we've had homes with mum and dad working from home on their laptops and maybe 2 or 3 kids studying from home. That's a lot of data going back and forth. Video conferencing, transferring files, and let's not forget all the entertainment uses as well. So we've needed a lot of data. Now, at the moment, over 2/3 of people on the NBN are taking a 50 megabit per second or higher plan. 10 years ago, when DSL was the way that most people got their broadband in Australia, 2/3 of people got less than 8 megabits per second, and quite a lot of people couldn't get anything. Now, if we were still in that world today, would working at home had been anything like as effective as it's been? Of course it wouldn't have been. So the NBN has really been there when we needed it. We've done a number of things to assist in making it work well. The NBN Co provided its retail service providers, Telstra, Optus, Vodafone, TPG, Vocus, provided all of them with an extra 40% of capacity at no extra charge. That in turn has got passed through to end users. That's been important. Things like supporting areas of particular need. So telemedicine. Greg Hunt, as Health Minister, introduced new telemedicine arrangements for GPs. NBN has come and backed that up by providing to GP clinics a free upgrade from whatever speed they're on to a 50/20 service to give that bandwidth for two-way video conferencing. NBN has committed $150 million for customers who are finding it difficult to pay their phone bills, so working with the RSPs, providing that relief, but also funding to support children in low-income families who are not connected to NBN to get connected at low or no cost, depending upon the individual RSP, so in turn they can be getting distance education. So NBN has really, I think, in a social sense as well as an economic sense, been really important. Collectively, NBN and the telco sector have worked together well. We set up a working group of NBN plus the major RSPs. One of the first things they said to me as Minister was, we've got to engage with the streaming services. So I did that. I asked the streaming services to reduce their bit rate by 25%. They've done that, and that alone generated an additional 4% of capacity across the NBN. At night, NBN's data usage, the volumes of traffic, is up by about 20%. During the day, it's up by as much as 70%, and it stood up well to that explosion in the amount of traffic that's being carried.
Last week, the Telecommunications reform package passed through the Senate. Why is that package important, and what will it enable?
Well, it does a number of things. It establishes what's called a statutory infrastructure provider. In most places, that will be NBN, but not always. In some places, there are competitor networks to NBN that are providing broadband. But this is the party that's responsible for people having a broadband service. So that's an important regulatory construct. There's also an arrangement for a payment, a levy of $7.10 a month per service per month in metro areas, and that effectively covers the cost of loss-making broadband services, the satellite and the fixed wireless. That RBL, that regional broadband levy, that's already being charged by NBN on what it charges for metropolitan broadband services. But it'll now be the case that competitors of NBN providing metropolitan broadband services will also need to pay that, and it will support the whole premise that profitable broadband services in the city cross-subsidise loss-making broadband services in regional and remote Australia. It costs a lot less per person to provide a broadband service in densely populated areas than it does in regional and remote Australia. The satellite service, for example, goes to really the last 2% of the population, but it covers the great majority of the 7.7 million square kilometres of Australia's landmass. So it's very expensive on a per person basis. So the whole system is set up so that overall broadband is profitable, and there's a cross-subsidy of the loss-making regional and remote services. So that RBL, that regional broadband levy, will be really important for that. That's now been legislated, It won't mean an increase in what people pay to use the NBN. It might possibly even mean a slight reduction. It will mean a modest levy going on competing broadband services, but it's all about making sure that Australians, wherever they are, have access to high quality, high speed broadband. It's important for social reasons, also important for economic reasons. You think about agriculture, for example. Australia has a world competitive, highly efficient agriculture sector. Ag tech is an increasingly important part of the competitiveness of agriculture. So it's really important that we've got high quality broadband services in country areas supporting our farmers. And that's one of the reasons why this cross-subsidy arrangement is an important part of that.
2019 seems a bit like a lifetime ago now, but if we're to reflect on the final months in 2019 and the bushfires, particularly across the eastern seaboard, how did our telecommunications infrastructure hold up?
Look, it's a very important question, because if you're in an area where a bushfire is bearing down, you really rely upon telecommunications to get information. Of course, our state fire agencies like the RFS and New South Wales Rural Fire Service use apps like Fires Near Me. They're using technology, smartphones, tablets, to distribute information to citizens. That's very important. So telecommunications is critical. What we saw in the 2019-20 bushfires was that overall the network held up well, and where there were outages they were repaired relatively quickly, but we still shouldn't shy away from the fact that we did have significant outages at critical times and at critical points. On the worst day, which was essentially New Year's Day, 1st of January, 2nd of January, around that time, there were about 150 mobile base stations out in New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia. So south coast of New South Wales, for example, holiday towns like Bateman's Bay, all up and down the south coast. Those towns had a lot of people there, many of them temporary visitors, and in a number of those towns the mobile service went out, and that's very distressing. If you're a temporary visitor to a town, you haven't got coverage, you can't communicate. One of the particular difficulties was that the FPOS network typically uses mobile, so if people went into a service station wanting to buy petrol or food, if there was no FPOS, a lot of people couldn't make a purchase. Now that's very distressing when you're in a town that's affected by bushfires. State government is telling you you need to leave this holiday town and head back to Sydney. So while it was only a finite number of people affected, for those who were affected, significant impact. We did a report that looked at exactly what happened. The Australian Communications and Media Authority prepared that, working with the telcos and their peak bodies, Communications Alliance and Australian Mobile Telecommunications Alliance. And what that found was there were over 800 outages that were caused by the bushfires. Now, a key finding was, overwhelmingly, the outages were due to the loss of power, loss of mains power. There were 11 outages that were due to direct fire damage. So that issue about mains power is critical. Just last week we announced a funding package, $27.1 million of new money and $10 million of repurposed money from the Mobile Black Spots program. And part of that will be $18 million to provide greater resilience for base stations, and that'll be particularly backup power that'll last for longer. That might be diesel generators, it might be batteries, solar plus batteries. But if we can have backup power that lasts for longer, then if the mains power goes down, that won't necessarily mean people losing a mobile service. And so we've learned, I think, some important lessons from the 2019-20 bushfires. Overall, the networks performed well. People in all of the telcos worked incredibly hard. There were people working all night to get network back up as quickly as possible. The typical outage was 3.5 days. Now, that can be a lifetime, of course, if you're in an area that's affected by a live fire. But overall, the carriers worked very quickly to get the network back up. But nevertheless, there are some things we can learn, and particularly making the network more resilient in the case of power outages prompted by bushfires or other natural disasters is a key lesson from the 2019-20 bushfires.
Just want to turn our attention to the ACCC's digital platforms inquiry. What were the key things from your perspective in that final report?
Well, the ACCC Digital Platforms Inquiry was a very big piece of work. It was kicked off in 2017 by Scott Morrison when he was Treasurer, and it was part of the package that the then Turnbull government developed, some major reforms of media regulation. And one of the things that was agreed to be done as part of that was to have the ACCC look at the impact of the digital platforms, and particularly Facebook and Google, on the Australian media businesses. Now, a lot of recommendations, over 20 recommendations from that report, and they dealt with a range of things. Some of them dealt with the media sector, and there was a recommendation that a current funding program to support regional and small publishers should be reconfigured. We've done that. We've reconfigured that into a larger program, $50 million, and indeed we're going out there right now seeking applications for funding under that program from regional broadcasters and regional newspapers, because those are businesses which have been hit very hard by COVID-19. But one of the other recommendations of the ACCC was that there ought to be a code regulating the dealings between Australian media businesses like News Corp, Seven West Media, Nine Entertainment Limited and so on the one hand, and the digital platforms like Facebook and Google on the other. And the ACCC's thinking in recommending this was that you have content which is generated by Australian media businesses. It costs them money to do that, and it's being used by the platforms. So, for example, people might search a news story through Google and end up on the website of Nine Entertainment Limited. Now, Google attracts eyeballs because people know that through that search engine, they can end up with a news organisation, a trusted Australian news organisation, getting access to a story that they're interested in. But of course, Google is able to monetize those eyeballs and sell advertising revenue in a lot of it. Similarly, Facebook, in people's news feeds, there will be content which is professionally generated by Australian media businesses, and at the moment, the question is there appropriate remuneration for this? So the ACCC recommended there should be a code to regulate these matters. Just a few weeks ago, the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, and I announced that in fact we'd accelerate that work, or we'd ask the ACCC to accelerate that work, and we'd ask them to make it a mandatory code. It'll be backed by the force of law. It won't be a voluntary code, it'll be a mandatory code. These are very important issues. They're critical to the future of Australian media in many ways. There's no doubt that Facebook and Google are very effective competitors for advertising revenue that used to sustain the Australian media businesses. Now, there's no problem with competition. We welcome competition. It's good for consumers. But it needs to be competition on a fair basis, on a level playing field. And when Australian media businesses have found it very hard to negotiate, to bargain with the digital platforms, which are giant global operations, then that's been a key reason why the ACCC has recommended there should be regulatory intervention.
The report into what that mandatory code might look like is not due out till July, but just to help ACS members, what are some of the things that you would expect to see incorporated that can address that competition landscape?
Well, that is for the ACCC to recommend, but I think it'll be matters like what is the bargaining process between an Australian media business on the one hand and one of the platforms on the other? Is there a requirement for the digital platforms to sit down and engage in a bargaining process? Is it individual media businesses, or would they bargain collectively? What's the sequencing here? Is it an individual commercial negotiation, and then if no pricing can be struck, then the ACCC would come in and set prices? Or would the ACCC not have a pricing role? These are all issues of detail. Now, bear in mind, the ACCC is very familiar with these kinds of issues. The ACCC, of course, is the regulator for telecommunications and gets involved at a very detailed level in setting prices. In a previous life as an Optus executive, I was responsible for negotiating with Telstra the prices they would charge Optus for things like PSTN originating and terminating access, or the price that was paid to terminate a mobile call from one network to another. Now, those were dealt with through commercial negotiation, but if a deal couldn't be reached, then the ACCC had the power to come in and set prices, the negotiate arbitrate model. Now, that's not necessarily the model the ACCC will propose here, but I instance that as an example of the fact that the ACCC does have extensive experience in setting the framework for commercial bargaining. You can look at the code that regulates the supermarkets. You know, there's a bargaining imbalance between the supermarkets and then very large numbers of individual suppliers of food, businesses that are supplying food or other products to the supermarket. So my point is that the ACCC has a lot of experience in dealing with these kinds of what are essentially commercial negotiations, but against the backdrop of an imbalance of bargaining power, which in turn raises competition policy issues. So that's what the government's asked the ACCC to turn its mind to here, to develop this code. It'll be engaging closely with Australian media businesses, with the digital platforms, and with other stakeholders as it does develop the code. And it's going to be important. It's being looked at carefully from other countries because these issues are not unique to Australia by any means. The enormous power, the market power that platforms like Google and Facebook have, as the ACCC pointed out, over 19 million Australians go to Google every month, over 17 million go to Facebook. So they're very, very powerful, and when they're using the content generated by media businesses in Australia or in other countries, absent regulatory intervention, it's not, or it hasn't historically been, a level playing field when it comes to bargaining as to the terms on which that content is used. So these are, appropriately in the Australian government's judgment, matters for regulatory engagement, and that's why we've charged the ACCC with that job.
Thank you. Now, I'm just going to ask one more question before I turn to members' questions, but please keep those coming through. They are coming through now. Final question from me, Minister. What has you most excited about 5G? Of
the benefits that 5G can deliver, so much greater bandwidth, much greater device density, so from a given base station the number of handsets or other devices that can be supported will be much bigger than on 4G. But the feature that I think will be most significant actually is very low latency. We are all used to low latency on fixed line networks, but we've accepted that one of the prices of the convenience of mobile communications is there is greater latency. Most of the time we don't notice it, but every now and then we do, and certainly for machine-to-machine applications it can be very significant. Now, if you think about the way that the transport sector is transforming, and I saw this a fair bit in a previous portfolio as Minister for Cities and Urban Infrastructure, there's enormous amount of work being done on driverless cars, on vehicles being networked. If you think about, for example, congestion on urban roads or on freeways, one of the reasons for that is each vehicle is making individual decisions about where to go. It would be, you could get huge benefits if the vehicles were networked and there was computer processing power applied to which vehicle goes where when. At the moment, that doesn't happen in the main, and it can't happen in part because of the communications challenges of doing that. But in a world where vehicles can be networked using 5G and networked in a way that the signal is very low latency, so it can go from the vehicle to a central processing unit, processing can occur and the signal can go back to the vehicle, And all that happens with sufficiently low latency that it's done quickly enough to get that information to a vehicle that's travelling at 110 kilometres an hour quickly and usefully. You can see huge potential for us to be able to use the finite amount of capacity on freeways more efficiently. So I think the coming together of communications and transport, taking advantage of that low latency, will be very powerful. And I think that's but one application. I think another one, again, the bushfire season, as we reflect on it, we're sending human beings into very dangerous situations to fight fires where temperatures are over 1,000 degrees Celsius. I was given one example of copper cables going to the BAI communications tower at Mount Wanderer, which serves Bateman's Bay. Folks from BAI went to look at their facility a few days after the bushfire, which had knocked out that broadcast tower, and the copper cables had melted. Now copper melts at over 1,000 degrees. It's a frightening example of how intense those fires were. In future, I think it's not easy, it's not hard to imagine at all, robotic vehicles networked using mobile communications and 5G going into fires, to fight fires, all managed and controlled centrally. So I think that combination of transport and communications, radio communications, wireless communications, is going to open up some really exciting new possibilities.
Thank you. First question coming in on cyber, which we haven't covered. To complement the good work of e-safety, is there any work being done to provide better resources for vulnerable people who, despite complying with e-safety guidelines, become victims of e-crime?
There is a lot of work going on in this space, and some of these issues fall halfway between online safety and cyber security. And particularly when we think of a consumer setting, if you give people advice about don't use PASSWORD as your password, make sure that you've got antivirus software from a reputable provider. How firm is the dividing line between that kind of advice and advice about if you get an email from somebody in Nigeria offering to transfer money into your bank account, you probably need to be wary of that. There's not a hard and fast line. Online safety sits with me as a Commonwealth Government responsibility. Cyber security sits with my colleague Peter Dutton, but we do work closely together, and we are giving thought to ways that particularly our education and our consumer information contains messages across that spectrum. What we want is citizens using computers, smartphones, tablets for all of the wonderful benefits that the internet provides, e-commerce, entertainment, staying in touch with people, but equally we want people alive to, aware of the risks and knowing what they need to do to manage those risks, whether that risk is a virus on your computer, whether it's ransomware, or whether it's women, and it is overwhelmingly women, sadly, being subject to unauthorised sharing of intimate images. All of those are the kinds of risks that people can be exposed to. When people go into the digital town square, they have a right to expect that the rule of law applies, that if something goes wrong, they can complain to government authorities, just as we expect that the rule of law will apply when we're in the physical town square. And so whether it comes to online safety or cyber security, those are the expectations people reasonably have of government, and that's where there's a lot of effort. And of course, to push the analogy one step further, we also ask people to take sensible measures for self-protection as well, but help people to understand what those measures are.
Thank you. Question from Jan Cornweevil. The arts sector has been badly affected. Is it too early to be planning how to help, particularly those working in the sector?
Look, it's an excellent question. The arts sector has been hit very hard. When venues are closed, when performances are cancelled, so revenue for most performing arts organisations has essentially gone to zero. At the same time, of course, they're having to hand back the revenue from tickets when performers have lost their gigs. The arts sector is undoubtedly one of the most seriously affected sectors by COVID-19. We are seeing some encouraging signs. Certainly there's been some great innovation, great use of digital infrastructure to get content out to people. That's very encouraging. At the same time, it's important that artists are being remunerated. And there have been some examples of artists and arts companies putting up content and charging people for it. And that's a good thing. I want to see that. I want to encourage that. We're seeing some early signs of activity resuming. I was on a video conference today with museum directors from around the country, including the director of the Museum and Art Gallery of Northern Territory, who told me today they are open because Northern Territory is a bit ahead of the rest of the country. That's encouraging news. Neighbours has started filming again with appropriate social distancing protocols. So film and television, part of the arts sector, had come to a halt, but some productions have resumed with some careful controls. But it's still the case that performing arts, live performing arts, in the main is not happening. Now, JobKeeper's been very important for the performing arts sector. Our biggest performing arts companies, the household name companies, generally have up to several hundred people who have been kept on the books through JobKeeper. But at the same time, of course, there's a lot of people in the arts sector who work on a casual basis. Now, they're eligible for JobSeeker, which includes the coronavirus supplement. So with that, that's about $1,100 a fortnight. Can be more with things like Commonwealth rental assistance and so on. Long-winded way of saying there's plenty of support going into the sector. That's important, but what's going to be most important is how the sector comes out of this. And just in the last few weeks, really the last couple of weeks, those conversations have started to happen. I certainly raised it in Cabinet. What's the path back? And I do think we'll see museums and galleries in the first wave of organisations able to reopen. But over time, subject to the public health advice, our arts sector will be back, and that'll be great.
Thank you. So, folks, we've got a few more coming in on cyber security, but if we could keep them focused on cyber safety. So, Janab, with the increase in the number of Australians working from home, which has created opportunities for cybercrime, what steps would you advise people to do to protect themselves from cyber attacks?
Look, that is more of a cyber security question than a cyber safety question. But as I mentioned earlier, there's certainly a continuum there rather than a hard line. I think the first thing is be conscious of the issues, and I'd say that the majority of people who are working from home are likely to be conscious of the issues, and in many cases, getting very good advice from their in-house IT teams as to the steps they need to take. And if you're connecting into your business, your employer's network, as most people will be doing, then obviously there'll be a lot of thought given to the safety and security issues there. One of the specific issues, though, is children. A lot more children at home and online, and children don't have the same awareness that it's not a great idea to be clicking on links in emails from people you don't know, for example. So I think one thing I'd say to people who are working from home is make sure you're keeping an eye on what your kids are doing, and try and give them a few simple rules, such as, never click on a link in an email without checking with mum and dad is a pretty good rule, because if a home PC gets infected, then obviously that can cause complications for everybody working from home.
Sega, the news of identity theft coming from superannuation release has exposed a few weaknesses. In this situation, how would you assure that the COVID Safe app will not expose citizens' privacy?
Look, we have done a lot of work on the COVID Safe app, and I want to acknowledge the help from a lot of people in the sector. You know, a lot of people, once the code was made available, jumped on and tested it, and we thank you for doing that. And were quick then to provide their findings on Twitter. And in the main, I think we were very pleased with what people had to say. People with heavy-duty coding expertise were generally pretty complimentary. Obviously, people where they thought there were vulnerabilities, they identified them. But overall, I think it's not always the case that coding efforts within government are given unanimous thumbs up. So I think we were reasonably pleased with the response, and in part that's because there were plenty of people helping, and there really was a Team Australia mentality there. Now, on the question of how do we protect people's privacy, with the app, there's a number of important safeguards built in, including the legislation that went through the Parliament last week that's very clear on what it can be used for, what it can't be used for. But as you know, the way it works is that when the Bluetooth handshake happens between my device and yours, and assuming you've got the app, I certainly do, then that handshake will have happened quite a few times now in the time we've been sitting here. So there'll be a code sitting on my device that links to your number. I can't see it. I can't get at it. The only way it can be got at is if I'm diagnosed, and then an employee of, in this case, New South Wales Health would call me, would say, well, Mr. Fletcher, we've got your result. You have been diagnosed with COVID-19. I'm now going to send a code to your device, and if you enter that code, it will then upload what's stored on your device to New South Wales Health, and we can then get the numbers and call people. So a very limited use case. The data doesn't stay on the device for any longer than the specified period of time. I am free, you are free. Anybody who has the app is free to delete the app at any time, and that deletes the data. So a lot of important safeguards there, and critically, it's there for a single purpose, which is to assist state and territory health officials to do contact tracing. As you know, different apps have been developed in different countries. In some scenarios I've seen described, a text message will go from a device of somebody who's been diagnosed to somebody they've been in contact with saying, I've been diagnosed, you should go get tested. We are not doing it that way in Australia. The only way you will be told that you've been diagnosed is with a call from a state government health official, state or territory health official, and then the data on your phone, if you authorise it to be released, will help state and territory health officials to do the contact tracing work. So we've been quite careful about how the data can be used, and that's been a quite deliberate design decision.
Thank you, Minister. We're just about to finish our live stream, but there's an encouragement for all ACS members. If you haven't downloaded the Safe app yet, please do. Better access to data for our healthcare professionals will help protect our most vulnerable. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Andrew. Pleasure.
And for members, don't forget our next live stream is 5:30 this Thursday evening. Hope to see you then. Thank you.